afternoon. My name is Tycho and I will be presenting you the news for today. In a few days it is the 11th of November, which means the First World War was ended exactly 100 years ago from then. One of the things we're going to talk about in today's news program is the importance of Remembrance Days and memorials of the First World War. Because how important is it? And do we need to keep those days and memorials and give it more or less attention? We're now switching over to two historians named Kyle and Jasper. We're sitting in the studio in Manchester and they are going to tell you more about the life of it in the trenches of the First World War and also about the memorials and remembrance days.
Good afternoon. I'm here with Jasper, expert about the First World War. We're going to talk about the importance of the remembrance of the First World War, and I'm going to talk about the many deaths that occurred in the First World War. So, the reason for the great importance for the remembrance of the First World War is mainly because there were so many deaths in the First World War. There were 700,000 military lives were lost during the First World War, compared to only 300,000 deaths in the Second World War. This was mainly because of the First World War was the first war that was really a trench warfare, which meant that a lot of soldiers were hiding in the trenches and you couldn't really attack the enemy trenches because of the new machine riflery of the First World War. You would just get shot down. Another reason is the ignorance of the commanders in the First World War. They just sent the military personnel to attack the enemy front line, and they had to cross what they called no man's land in between the trenches, and they would just get shot down. You couldn't attack the enemies. And even the tanks at the beginning of the First World War couldn't cross the trenches because they didn't have their crawler tracks underneath the tanks. They used to just drive on regular wheels, which sank into the trenches if you wanted to cross them. Another reason was the bad hygiene in the trenches. Especially the British trenches were laid lower than the German trenches, which meant a lot of water. If it were to rain, a lot of water would drain the trenches, and soldiers would get what they call trench foot, which is basically when they walk in the water in the trenches with bare feet or even with socks, they would get mold between their feet. And this was a major problem in the First World War. This caused a lot of diseases, and there were many rats as well in the trenches. And I think this is one of the main reasons why the importance of remembrance is so large. And so Jasper, do you have any other information about remembrance or what people should know?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, there were many people died in World War I. That's why it's just so important to remember this war. It's the biggest war in Britain history, and as mentioned before by Cal, there were a lot of deaths in World War I. That's why it's so important to remember all these fallen soldiers in World War I. As you may know, the 11th of November, as Tycho mentioned before, is the 100-year anniversary of the war. That's on the 11th. It's 100 years ago when the war ended. All these dead peoples are buried in mass graves. As you can see here, we have footage of the mass cemeteries in Ypres. Ypres is a place where a lot of Britons go to see there are a lot of cemeteries there. All these cemeteries are a little part of Britain, so the British government has to take care of these cemeteries. That's also why they are really well maintained, and it's important to keep them that way, so that people can always visit these cemeteries to remember all the fallen soldiers.
Yeah, and I also think one of the reasons it's very important to remember the war is because people think of a war as a time where you fight the enemy, but also for you and your comrades it's a very bad time, because it wasn't the case that you could just leave the trenches if you wanted or if you didn't feel well. There were only basically two ways to get out of the warfare, and that was either you have to get what they would call a bloody one, and you get sent back to England, and you'd only get this if you were unable to fight in the war anymore. So if you lost a limb or something something like that. And the other way to escape the war was to just run, but it wasn't allowed to run or to escape, so you would run the risk of getting shot. And that's why many soldiers lost their lives trying to escape as well. And I think that's another reason why it's very important to remember that it wasn't just a war where you wanted to fight the enemy, but it was very painful, and it was also very traumatizing for many soldiers. And it's not only the physical work that was very hard, but also mentally it was very hard for the soldiers, I think.
Yeah, I think that's why we need to keep remembering these wars. We need to keep remembering the negative points of this war, and that's in that way we don't start such kind of war again. But let's talk a little bit out of the remembrance in other countries, especially Europe. Europe, the war was in Europe, so the countries in Europe, the war is relatively known by especially the adults. But there's a problem that the new generation of people don't care that much about the war anymore. They don't have grandfathers or relatives that have stories about the war, and I think that's a big problem, because when we don't remember how bad it was, such a war may start easier again.
Yeah, I think those the stories of soldiers that fought there should live on and not just die.
Yeah. And that's why services and remembrances need to be organized in especially countries all over Europe. In Britain, there are really big services for the remembrance, especially on the 11th of November. It's 100 years ago, so that's logic. But in other countries, the remembrance isn't that special. Maybe a few remembrances at cemeteries, but not as big as in Britain. So it's really important that we can't let this happen again, such war, and that's why we have to put more effort in remembering this war.
Okay, we're gonna switch back to Tycho in the studio in London.
Thank you, Kyle and Jasper, that was really informative. Another really important thing of the First World War was conscription. You may not know what it is, but Walter's in Ypres and he's going to tell you more information about that.
Thank you, Tycho. That's right. We're standing here in Ypres, one of the train tracks where many soldiers were transferred to the warfare to fight and die for their country. Now, in the First World War, there was made use of conscription. Many people don't actually know what that means, so I'll be telling you something about it. So maybe if we use the word draft, you'll get what it means. It's basically the compulsory enlistment of young men between the ages of 18 to 40 to fight for their country and to die for their country. It wasn't used before the First World War. Conscription was used to fill up the empty spaces in the army, because a lot of people died actually, and the volunteers, although they were in the first year of the war around 3 million volunteers, the numbers of volunteers started to decrease slowly, so there weren't enough soldiers to fill the British army. Conscription was used to fill up the wounded and the fallen soldiers, so that the English could replace those soldiers and fight in the front. Not only the English suffered from great losses, but the French did too, which is why the British army needed way more men than they already had. Well, like I said, conscription was introduced in the First World War, but it didn't happen overnight. It actually took the parliament, the government, to vote for it, because a lot of people were against it because they didn't want to fight. So after it was voted out, people were called up upon to fight for the country, but many didn't want to actually. Even though a lot of people didn't want and they marched against it, 1.1 million people actually signed up to go and fight in the first year of active conscription. Later on in the war, when men were really needed at the front, the age restrictions from 18 to 40 were actually changed to 16 to 60. So a lot of people would actually have the possibility to fight when they didn't have it before. But even though it's only 16 now, when the age criteria was 18, a lot of minors would actually try to go and fight by using a fake name or being held the hand by the people at the station where you could sign up to fight. So conscription, it helped the country out a lot. It gave the soldiers, but at what cost? Because a lot of people lost their sons or husbands, and basically every man in the village would die. Back to you, Tycho, in the studio, live here from Ypres.
Thank you, Walter. Well, this was the news for today. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.
Klaar!